All right, folks, welcome back to another pilot episode for the Listening Game podcast. Really excited for the guest that we have today. In fact, this guest is the one who's been enabling the other recordings. He's been helping me out behind the scenes, and that's none other than Tim Morton, producer extraordinaire. Dude, thank you so much for being here. Beyond just the conversation, but your equipment and your time and your belief in the whole idea of conversation around games and what it means to make them. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Of course, if you're watching for the first time, you want to know more about what this podcast is all about or what we're trying to do, there's a dedicated video on the YouTube channel you can take a look at and learn more. But for now, we're going to be talking to Tim about his life and his journey in games, and I'm super excited to have Tim. I obviously had a great chance to collaborate and work with Tim at my time at Blizzard on StarCraft II, and this is a very talented, gifted man when it comes to making very complicated, creative video games. So, dude, thank you for being here.
Oh, really? Thanks for having me. I'm excited to get a chance to catch up.
Dude, yeah, for sure. That is the joy of these long conversations, is it's an opportunity to truly talk with a lot of intention, and I realize how much I don't even get a chance to do that in my normal day-to-day. So it's weird that it takes all of this to ensure that we have an opportunity to talk, but that's really, really cool. Well, dude, let's talk about games broadly. You've had an extraordinary career. You've worked with large companies. You've worked in the startup scenario on your own vision, but talk to me about how it all began. Like, why games for you? Like, what is it about games? When did it start? Were you, early adopter for video games, but what drove you towards this career and really got you interested in it?
Sure. I got into games pretty much straight out of college, and I think I was a computer science major, and one of the things that I saw was a lot of my classmates going into very traditional, go work for Hewlett-Packard or something like that. And I didn't want to wind up like that. I was a game player, so had an interest in games. But really, I think games appealed for being at the intersection of technology and creativity and business, having all of those elements. And, to be fair, I'm sure working on something at Hewlett-Packard might have that too, but not quite in the same way. So anyhow, I was just drawn to games. And I saw literally, I think just a want ad that Activision was hiring. And I had grown up playing a lot of Pitfall, and I had an Atari 2600. So that was super exciting to me, to maybe go work for a place whose games I had played. I also interviewed at Westwood back then and a couple others, but Activision was the place that made me an offer, so off it went.
How old were you at that point? So this was post-school, out of school?
Yeah, so I guess I would have been 22.
Yeah. Awesome. And what was your first project that you worked on with Activision? First
project there was the Macintosh version of Return to Zork, of all things.
Interesting. So, Wow. Man. That's incredible. So how long were you with Activision during that time?
It was about a 5-year run.
5
so
years,
it was, and Activision was super small at that point in time, less than 50 people, and had sort of a startup vibe to it. We were in a very small office. I actually, funny story here, my first desk, because they didn't have enough room, that happens in startups a lot. So they put me in the office supply cube.
No way.
And so other people see somebody sitting in the office supply cube, they assume it's the office supply clerk. And of course, I'm like trying to program Return to Zork Macintosh, but people come up and ask for a legal pad or a pen, and I know where everything is because I sit there. So I would just hand it to them. And 6 months later, we moved to another building, and I got my own desk, and everything was good. And people would still come up to me and be like, "Hey man, I need a legal pad." I'm like, "Yeah, I don't. It's not actually what I do, but I'm sorry."
Oh man, dude, what an interesting story. That in some ways encapsulates what it feels like to make games. In some ways, where you're like, "Yes, of course, I'll take out the trash or whatever." Like, especially with smaller teams, like you just kind of do whatever it takes. But what a funny little story there that it sort of followed you.
Yeah. Well, it was cool because I got to meet everybody. So
That's awesome, man. So you were programming. What happened to sort of make this shift towards production? I mean, was that a natural migration for you? Did it happen on a specific job or a specific task? Like, how did that shift happen? If you had to dissect it, and what made that even from a personal interest place? Like, did you decide you wanted to sort of pursue that path more than the more technical path? What made that sort of evolution happen for you?
I have a feeling this is the case for a lot of people in a lot of jobs, but you're working at a place at a fairly low level, subject to decisions of others, and you think to yourself, I feel like there's a way to do this better. And certainly at the point in time that I came into Activision, there weren't a lot of people there who had shipped games, so everybody was kind of figuring it out as they went along. To be fair, there were a few, obviously, but by and large, most of us hadn't shipped games. So there really were a lot of opportunities to improve and do it better, and it's not a fault on anybody who was leading. But so I was attracted to trying to make things work better, and there was a period where I was both engineering and producing. Very quickly, I realized that it was impossible to depend on me for critical path engineering tasks if I was also trying to do all this organizational stuff. So over a period of years, I kind of took on less and less engineering and more production. So,
Got it. So, and where would that have happened in your career? So you leave Activision 5 years in. What was next in terms of the next chapter, and when did this production sort of arc take place?
Happened, midway through my time at Activision, I guess. I worked on a project called MechWarrior 2, which was a remarkably small team by today's standards, but back then it was, 20, 25 people is a huge team back in 95. So I was starting to take on more production responsibility there. Got to a point inside Activision where many of us there at the time were feeling the itch to go try our hand at making games independently. And we see that cycle, I think, everywhere, but certainly that being my first experience in games, like, it was new to me. We did a somewhat unusual thing, which was approach the management team at Activision and say, hey, would you be willing to support us building something outside Activision, but still, publish us and enable us to do this? And my boss at that time was a guy named Alan Gershenfeld, and just a really, I think, open-minded, great person. And he was willing to have this conversation with us, and unbeknownst to us, was actually having a similar conversation with the guys who would go on to found Pandemic Studios. So literally within 2 weeks of each other, not knowing that the others were doing this, independently approached management about spinning off. And so we took one team, Pandemic took two teams, and we rented a space and got computers and all the things that you need to do to spin up a studio, and set off on a journey that involved a whole lot of mistakes and learning, and
I'd love to unpack that a little bit. I think if there's one thing I've been so fascinated by and appreciative of in my time since leaving Blizzard, is that whole entrepreneurial side of making games and how daunting it is. Look, how complicated making a game is in general, but then the idea of figuring out how to, maintain a viable business and, make sure your employees are happy and everyone is, has buy-in on the product. And it is a very complicated problem, and one, when at a large company like Blizzard, you can sometimes feel a little distant from. The machine in the boat is moving, you have your job, but the overall, holistic view of everything that's going on can be a little abstracted, or at least distanced from your day-to-day. But what was that transition like for you? I mean, how did you even begin to absorb those differences and tackle them in some ways?
The first thing I'll call out is that I had two really great partners who had their own set of professional experiences and life experiences that joined me on embarking on that crazy journey. So that helped a lot to have others to bounce ideas off of, but also to leverage their individual strengths and divide the work a bit.
Who were those folks?
And those, worth giving them the shout out. So Chaco Sunny
Nice,
and
yes.
John LaFleur, both of whom are actually now at Blizzard. So interesting that we had all wound up in the same place years later. But we had been at Activision together, and so they were part of embarking on creating this startup. But there is so much.
And your startup, just so we can get it out there, was Savage Games.
It was,
correct?
yeah, Savage Entertainment. There is so much about starting a company that's just completely orthogonal to the craft of making games. Like, getting benefits set up and, dealing with corporate structure and accountants and attorneys and all of these things that, they, as you said, all that happens at Blizzard, but it's largely taken care of by somebody else. So now it's our problem to get all of this stuff set up. And great learning experience, but it really, though it's necessary in order to be able to make a game, it has nothing to do with making a game. Like the craft of making a game is this completely separate skill set. So anyhow, there was a lot of learning involved in getting that done. But once we got it done, then we had to figure out the business side. How do you get deals? What does a good deal look like? A fair contract? How do you operate externally? Because it is so different from operating inside a big company. And we had a lot of naive notions about how easy and how great that would be, made lots of mistakes and had to learn from those along the way.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That skill set is so intriguingly different. Even the one of, like you're saying, finding work or pitching ideas or sharing, like it is a strange muscle set that I think when on a larger team or a more entrenched team like Activision or Blizzard, you just don't get to flex as much, and you certainly don't have to flex under the tension of keep your business alive or keep your team alive and afloat. Like, it's a pretty high stress scenario, right? At least I imagine.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And I think the burden of responsibility for making sure that this team that you now have to pay every 2 weeks is safe and covered, because these people are your friends, they have mortgages and families, and that it's a huge burden of responsibility that you don't necessarily appreciate when you're at a big company, because that's just not a thing you think about. So.
Were there kinds of games you were looking to make? Like when you set off to make Savage, what was the big dream? What were the kinds of games that you felt like you wanted to bring to the table that weren't being brought previously?
Having just come off of MechWarrior 2, and we did another product with Dustin Browder, actually, Heavy Gear, which was also a giant robot combat sim. The deal that we got with Activision was to do another Heavy Gear game. But rather than being genre focused, I think really Savage as a group, and this is true for a lot of independent studios, the dream was to create our own original games, original intellectual property, but also just really try to innovate in genre. So this was a means to that end. It wasn't like accomplishing the end goal, but it was kind of getting us set up. And very quickly, some harsh business realities hit us. We were doing a sequel to a sequel, and the thing that we were going to be a sequel to was still being developed inside Activision by another team. And it launched, it sold not to expectations, and just harsh business reality. If something doesn't sell, the sequel's going to get canceled. And that's what happened to us. And so we had to undertake this mad scramble to find new work, or else lose the company and perhaps put our friends in a position where they're in a difficult financial place. So yeah, it's like within the first year, we already had to deal with some really challenging stuff like that.
How did you get through that? Like, what was the solve? Was it doing some contract work for other studios? What was the answer? Like, how did you make the ends meet? And
yeah, you nailed it. We had to very quickly reach out to everybody that we could think of to try to find other work. And we were lucky at the time to get a deal to do a Jurassic Park game, which was a great contract. Obviously, everybody knew the license, so it really felt like it was going to be a happy outcome. And, went 9 months again on that and found ourselves again in a difficult situation. So it just kind of underscores how rough it can be on the outside. Obviously, some studios have better experiences, some studios have worse, but it was challenging.
Man, so how long did this season for you last? And how did you decide to how did you decide to solve or address these harsher realities?
I think you just try your best to adapt and survive. That's probably all of us always. But certainly the things that got us through, like, again, having two great partners made a big deal, a big difference. Also, the team's dedication and just the friends that we had from having worked at Activision and other friends that we made over the year really helped us get through it all, because they would help us find other projects. And we kind of got into a cycle of having then multiple revenue streams from multiple smaller projects instead of having all of our eggs in one basket. Like that was one learning, and got to a place that was a bit more stable over time, but very much always having to hustle for the next deal, very much always having to do sort of hard milestone-based deliveries, which force you to compromise whatever needs to be compromised in order to hit the milestone. So it really, we didn't know this going in, but that advance against royalty is the contract structure. So that business model that is so milestone-driven, it's very difficult to create the kind of quality that you can create inside a bigger developer. And of course, your identity, your reputation, like the future success of your business depends so much on the quality of what you do. So you do your best, but you can't just decide, I'm going to add 6 months to the schedule, because that's your client's not going to be okay with that. You've got to hit the date that they want you to hit.
Interesting. And so this season of leaving Activision and pursuing your own thing, how long was that? How long did you sort of stay in this place in your work and with your team?
12 years. So it was a long run.
And it was all pretty much in that vein of fight and survive.
The whole time you're always creating new pitches and new prototypes. Often what happens, or at least happened for us, is we would create an original pitch, and then somebody would see it and they'd be like, that would make a good He-Man game. Let's
wrap it in.
Have you work on He-Man or other IPs like that. So literally everything we did was work for hire. It was licensed IP, and at a certain point, I think all of us wanted to go back to being able to make big games that we were really proud of. So each of the partners left at a different point. I was kind of the most stubborn and left last, but after 12 years, we were all at different places.
Man, that's interesting and challenging. It's an interesting reality. Like, this is such a brutal industry, and it's very challenging in that regard. Like, to step out into your own, to pursue the dream, and the harsh realities of life, like, kind of collide with you. Like, where did that leave you? I mean, did it leave you feeling accomplished? Because clearly, in the midst of that tension, is a ton of growth, a ton of accomplishment, a ton of, like, sort of trial by fire, refining you as a game developer, even though it's kind of wrapped in this very brutal path of sort of refinement. Like, is that something? Did you feel that way at the end of this chapter, or as you decided to sort of move on, or was it not that way? Like, get us into the mindset of Tim. Was this?
I felt beaten up, for sure. Felt a lot of self-doubt about, am I capable of making good games? Like, am I capable of leading a successful team? And one of the sacrifices that we chose to make, whether it was a good idea or not a good idea, was to forego our own salaries to make sure the team got paid. So it also left me in a place where I was like, I need a job.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. So who got you? Where did you end up landing in this chapter?
Yeah, I wound up going to Electronic Arts Los Angeles.
Gotcha.
And being part of a new studio that was spinning up there called Victory Games, led by John Van Keneghem, who was the founder of New World that had made Heroes of Might and Magic, and he just, is a tremendous talent when it comes to game design, new ideas, and also running a studio. So very lucky that the timing lined up, that I had that opportunity, and that gave me a chance to work for the first time in real-time strategy, which was a genre that I love to play. So just, getting to dovetail the genre that you love with the work that you're doing every day is amazing. That was great.
And that's through the Command & Conquer license, is that correct?
That was Command & Conquer Generals, yeah.
Right.
It was going to be Generals 2, but then it became Command & Conquer Live. But anyway,
Command & Conquer. Now, it's interesting, you mentioned this earlier, but you had rubbed shoulders with Dustin Browder very early in his career, it sounded like. And you guys also worked on Command & Conquer as well, or no?
Separately, yeah. Dustin was on Red Alert and then the first Generals, and also some Battle for Middle-earth titles. So, yeah, I was on MechWarrior 2 Mercenaries when Dustin started in the games industry. So I actually remember his first day showing around. And, yeah, he was really a pleasure to work with. And he brought, again, rewinding to the Activision period, like there wasn't a deep set of experience there at that point in time, and I think Dustin brought this very methodical thought process to game design that was an asset to that team.
So
yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned that just obviously because the future part of your work has you guys overlapping again in this area of RTS specifically, which is really awesome. And so you work at EA for a season on the Command & Conquer license. How long was that?
That was 3 years.
3 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And then it was after that you joined the crew at Blizzard? Is that correct?
Yeah, I did a brief stint in between at Sony Santa Monica on God of War. But, but yeah, I think the continuity of coming off of Command & Conquer and then having that opportunity to work on StarCraft II, obviously, again, dovetailed really nicely.
So I don't want to skip over that transition from this really harsh startup space to back to this sort of larger, entrenched stable entity in EA. What was that sort of re-entry like for you? I mean, I imagine in some ways, given where you were, in terms of income and, sacrifice and all of that it's a welcome respite in many ways. But was there anything about that transition that was somewhat shocking, being back in that space? Did it feel like the industry had changed? I don't know. I'm just curious what that re-entry was like.
Great question, yeah.
Because
yeah, I think in some ways, big relief, because I don't have to worry about everybody getting paid every couple of weeks. So that was awesome. But related to that is just, it was awesome to be able to spend 100% of my focus on trying to build a great game instead of all of the stuff that's necessary to worry about keeping a company running. So those were wonderful. I think having been running a company just prior, there was that adjustment to going back to, okay, I'm a middle manager now, so I need to vet everything. I can't just make decisions, because my temptation was always to just make the call. But so you kind of get past that. But the other thing was, game industry had changed a bit in terms of the shift to free-to-play was happening, the shift to live service was happening, and also just some amount of process around game development, how to architect bigger teams. That team was distributed development, so it had art in Shanghai and engineering in Austin.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they're just, all of these were more good learning experiences too.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting to think that. So how long ago was this distributed team reality on the EA side? That was
that one was I was there from 2010 to 2013-ish.
Okay,
I guess.
interesting. Because obviously that's a big part of where it seems like teams are headed these days. But to know that was the case even back then, and figuring out how to do that
Yeah.
What were the challenges of working with a team distributed globally like that back then? How did you solve for what is already a very complicated process, making games in this collaborative environment, but doing it distributed in that way? How did you solve that?
Thankfully, a lot of thought had already gone into that before I joined.
Sure.
And so I was able to learn from some of the things that team had already put in place. Some things that they had done that were helpful were having a video wall, we called it, but a big screen TV with a teleconferencing system on it it was just always open to the Austin team. And so you could walk up to that and ask somebody a question or whatever, and maybe it didn't get used as much as we thought it might at the beginning, but certainly for team meetings and for other things, it's just everybody felt more integrated that way. Definitely still challenges enabling people to feel connected, but that helped. And with Shanghai, because of the time difference, the working hours overlap was smaller, so it put a little bit of a burden on both teams to add some hours to the overlapping period so that there was an opportunity to communicate. But really just a big effort on communication. And at the beginning of the day, the leads on the art side would come in to the LA office and review the work that had been done overnight, create a lot of feedback based on that and very detailed notes, and that would go back to the Shanghai team, and there would be some video syncs again so that communication feels a little bit more personal. But it takes a lot of conscious effort to try to make a distributed team work. And I think a lot of people tend to underestimate the overhead of that. You just get tempted by like, oh, the man-month rate is so low in country X, like we'll just throw a lot of people at it. But it still requires people in the host team, wherever that team is located, to manage that process. So,
yeah, it's so funny. I want to believe that these kinds of distributed teams work and are effective, but having worked on games and realizing how collaborative they are, that it's hard to exactly figure out how that sort of stickiness of humanity, being close to one another, like how valuable is that, and can you really make up for it if it's not there? I guess we'll continue to see as more and more teams work this way. I'm sure it's inevitable in some ways, like you're saying, that this sort of falls out this way, given how we're connecting more and more.
My opinion coming off that experience was that it's possible to make it work, but it's not trivial. Like it really, and there's a tax that you pay. And I'll say, like, if the budget is there, it's easier to just have an integrated team. But it's possible to make a distributed team work.
Yeah, got it. So what were some of the highlights of your time working on Command & Conquer at EA? I want to obviously hit that, and then we'll transition into the Blizzard piece. But, what were some of the joys there, working on RTS, working at EA?
And some just amazing people on that team. I think those were a lot of the positives. And EA, every place has good and bad. Like, obviously, they get some criticism from the community. But, they have really been a major force in game development and game publishing for a long time. And so there is a lot of goodness there. There's stuff that, could be better as well. But, I did feel like I learned a lot from my time there. I think if there's one constant in all of these stories of my time in the industry, it's just how much change happens and how subject projects can be to, ending as a result of that change. And indeed, that's what happened with that project. And that was actually the longest I've worked on something that didn't get to cross the finish line. 3 years of effort for me and longer for some others who had been on that team before I got there. That hurts to work on something that long and not see it get launched. But so it goes.
What can you talk about in terms of the decisions on that? Like, is there anything you can say about whys and hows? Because I know there are some diehard Command & Conquer fans out there that were excited for whatever would be next, and then it's.
I don't think there's a single thing. I think it's a combination of things. But from my perspective, at least, the biggest thing that led to this outcome was leadership changes at EA. We started under John Riccitiello, who really was a believer in the platform, believer in the genre, believer in the business model. And you need those executive advocates, proponents, like supporters, for a project to succeed. And after Riccitiello left EA, Probst was briefly running the company. Andrew Wilson came in, but each of them had their own executive teams underneath them, and those changes really impacted us as a product. We got shifted from sort of a traditional story-based RTS to a free-to-play RTS, and then ultimately at the end, I think there was a desire for us to go back, but we were so far down this other path that, for what it's worth, wasn't the path we had originally wanted to go down anyway. So it kind of felt tragic from that perspective, but many other things that contributed. But at the end of the day, I do think the single biggest thing was just those shifts in leadership and shifts in strategy for the company.
Yeah, those can cause massive ripples, as we've seen in many instances with larger companies. So you end up transitioning over to the Blizzard side, and I believe this happened on StarCraft II during a time, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Heroes was spinning up. Is that about that window? Some of the leadership or the traditional leadership on StarCraft II were shifting to Heroes, and you came in the midst of StarCraft II being a live game, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, it really, it's such a crazy thing in my experience for a game that is so renowned and so successful, to have openings for new leadership. That's pretty rare. And because you were already there and inside Blizzard, that what was going on behind the scenes was that the existing team leadership was shifting focus to Heroes of the Storm. And so StarCraft II, which literally is one of my favorite games ever, like I was a definite fan on the outside, suddenly there was this opportunity to come in and help lead the team. So that was just fortuitous timing for me, though I mentioned I was at Sony at that point in time, so there was a bit of a hard decision to make about leaving the God of War team to go to Blizzard. But anyway, it just worked out great. So.
Right, I'm sorry we skipped over the God of War piece. Yeah, that's correct. How long were you with Sony before you made the Blizzard?
Wound up being basically 6 months. I think it was 5 at the end of the day. Yeah.
So you reconnect with some of these people from your past, right? People like Dustin, and what was it like? How had Dustin changed? I'm curious, as just a little talking point between when you knew him before and now.
Well, let's see. Dustin, he had less hair. So that was one way he had changed. But I'm following suit now. I think Dustin and I had kept in touch on and off over the years. And I think I was probably a little bit annoying asking him for, multiplayer advice on StarCraft II from the outside. He was like, build more workers, which I probably legitimately needed to do.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think Dustin has always had a lot of charisma, so I think that was very consistent. But I hadn't worked with Dustin as a game director.
Yeah.
And so definitely that was a change in how we related in our roles. But again, he was more focused on Heroes of the Storm at that point. So I was working with guys like David Kim and Jason Huck and Matt Morris. So all these guys who had come up under Dustin more so than Dustin himself.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about StarCraft II. Like you said, it sounds like you have a history as a player with the game and a passion, obviously, for RTS, given where you came from. But what was it like stepping into that whole world? The sort of legacy that the game had coming from Brood War into its current state. Were there expectations you had that, maybe surprised you, or things that you didn't anticipate? What was that transition like, stepping into a game like StarCraft II? It's an interesting and fascinating game as it relates to the industry at large, but super passionate players, competitive esport.
Totally.
Yeah, what was that like?
I mean, I think the first thing coming into any new team, and hopefully people can relate, like starting any new job, there's just this sense of needing to learn how things work at the new place and start to build trust with the people on the team and all of that. So definitely there was a period of just figuring out how things worked at Blizzard and how things worked on Team One. The executive producer, Chris Siggety, who we both worked with, really was just outstanding at helping me through that process and getting me set up for success with the team. But we were, before the launch of Legacy of the Void, but Void production had already started. So the team was partway through, and there were campaign missions that already existed in some state and cutscenes that already existed in some. So there was work in progress, but then there was also a lot to figure out about how far were we going to go, what was the shape of the product going to be. So it was a lot of fun to learn how the story was going to end.
Yeah, exactly.
As a fan, like, oh my God. But also, just to be involved in mapping the path to launching Void.
Yeah, it's interesting, considering a third expansion or a third offering on behalf of a game that, competitive multiplayer is a tricky problem. It's something that people always want to be tweaked and adjusted, but how far do you tweak and adjust it? And, if Legacy of the Void is a new offering, how much new do you bring to the table in the midst of a game that already has, committed players who've invested huge chunks of their lives around? Like, how much do you really want to disrupt that? But clearly you need to bring something new in order to, sort of warrant the expansion nature of the product you're building. So that is absolutely a difficult problem to figure out how to solve.
Yeah, and I had a lot of learning to do there, and thankfully, obviously Dustin had laid a good foundation. David Kim was in charge of the balance team at that point, so it wasn't like they were looking to me to self-balance, but definitely in terms of the questions you asked of how much do we change, there were decisions to make there, and also from an esports perspective, I had been to BlizzCon, I had been to an MLG, so I had some exposure to the scene, but you don't really appreciate the depth of passion around StarCraft II esports until you're either deep in the scene or working on the StarCraft II scene or StarCraft II team. So there was some learning for me there too.
Yeah. Talk to me about the impact of this kind of games as service mentality, and maybe what that was like in terms of the conversations around legacy and the pressures, this and that. How did you feel like those conversations impacted the product? I mean, clearly they had an impact in terms of separating out some of these pieces to make the game, I think, fit the way gamers were relating to products in the current era. But what was that conversation like, and what was your position on it at the time? I'm hyper curious about how the industry is shifting in this way and how we continue to make, I think, healthy business decisions, but also decisions that think about the end user in the best possible way. How did you feel like those conversations were impacting StarCraft II, and what was your place in all of that?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Void was a traditional expansion in a lot of ways, and the team was very much geared towards having multiple years to get to a release, and that release being sort of a big box style launch, even though a lot of it's digital, but still box style launch. Having come from a team at EA that was trying to build a live service, my headspace was a bit more towards, are there things that we can do around micro content, events in the game, really trying to have a cadence of content release that cultivates post-launch engagement. So I was advocating hard, both with the team and with leadership at Blizzard, to make that happen. It was a bit of it took some convincing on both sides.
Yeah.
I think the team was skeptical that we could deliver content in less time than we had previously for these big box launches. And I think leadership was a little skeptical of my motives. On the one hand, is this guy just trying to keep the team together and also skeptical around the business model, because it just, as much as, WoW is arguably a live service, they have a long release cadence between things and sort of big dollar value things that they launch. The smaller dollar value micro content strategy, I guess, Hearthstone was starting to do some things down that path. Certainly Heroes was poised to do that, but it was new to Blizzard, and so there was some convincing that had to happen. But thanks in great part to Mike Morhaime, who bought into the vision for it, we had the ability to keep the team together, and amazingly, after Void launch, the team actually continued to grow to support this micro content strategy. And we didn't have a template in terms of other RTS games to look at who had approached it this way. So there was a lot of experimentation and just trial and error.
Yeah, to dive down into the the sort of the enthusiast conversation here, to talk more specifically about StarCraft II, I want to hear a little bit more about the birth of co-op commanders in that regard. I remember some of these conversations and remember being fascinated by some of the analytics around StarCraft II, which drove the conversations or the insight around why we should even consider making content like this. But I'd love to hear it from your perspective. Co-op commanders, where did it come from? Why does it exist? And obviously it fits with the conversation we were just talking about to some degree, but I think it's even more interesting than that. If we dive another layer deep, I'd love to hear you talk about that a bit.
Sure, yeah, and it's a cool subsection of StarCraft, in as much as it was brand new for Legacy of the Void, and I think was a little bit hotly debated by the team before the launch. So yeah, there are some fun aspects to talk about there. But the first thing I would say is that it's not the case that the idea for co-op came from the Command and Conquer thing I was working on. And I've seen some people in the community speculate that might have been the case, because the CNC thing that I was working on was very hero-based and cooperative. Like, there are definitely similarities there, but the StarCraft II team had already been working on that by the time that I joined the team. And David Sum, Matt Morris, like, these guys were pushing to innovate and create this as a new game mode. And I think Dustin was really instrumental in helping steer that vision towards maximizing collaboration and not just making it feel like two players having their own separate experiences in the world. And that's, never going to be 100% of the time, but I think the extent to which that succeeded, like, Dustin really helped push those guys to solve some of those problems. But anyhow, as you get deep into production on a project, there's always stuff that needs more resources and runs over. And so I think at various points there was temptation to cut co-op as a mode so that people could really focus on nailing campaign and really focus on nailing what competitive was going to look like for Void. Thankfully, the guys on the co-op team really stuck to their guns and defended it, and I tried to help defend it because I was a believer in it coming from the Command and Conquer experience. So in the end, it launched much smaller than it is today, like smaller set of commanders, smaller set of maps, didn't have mutators or mastery, but it really clearly resonated in terms of the data we were seeing on the back end. Like, a big subsection of players were playing this co-op mode, and that enabled us to continue to invest in it and grow it and get it to where it is today.
I think one of the things that I recall from that time was looking at the analytics around player time in StarCraft II. And you always think about StarCraft II as this stalwart multiplayer game, obviously strong campaign, the storytelling that Blizzard's known for. But as we began to look at the analytics, you're like, oh my gosh, so much of the people who are playing this game are playing it in almost a PvE-like fashion, or playing against bots in multiplayer, right? Like the numbers for that were extraordinarily high. And I just remember the thought process around, we should provide content for these players, right? That we have a huge amount of active players who are engaged in this way, and yet maybe the lens of what a Blizzard experience for folks who are playing a game in this way could be more compelling, or could be more interesting, right? And I don't know, I remember like having great respect for those conversations, because it was a developer looking at a passionate player base and saying, we can serve them better. That's what I recall about some of those conversations.
Well, and of course, your role on the community side when I joined, I think puts you in a position of making recommendations
Sure.
to the dev team that, at least my sense was coming in, were not always being
Sure.
Appreciated.
It's
or,
a challenge.
or listened to.
Yeah.
And certainly one of the things I saw that I was really happy to see was a shift in the team's philosophy around this stuff. That there was a little bit of, I think, ivory tower mentality of the game designers know best, and it's like game designers are game designers for a reason. They really do have deep expertise and knowledge, but it is so important to listen to the community and understand. It's easy to kind of lose the message to the noise. Like there's a lot of maybe race-specific balance feedback that's a little biased and whatnot. But underneath all of that, there really are legitimate concerns and legitimate opportunities to improve that come out of that feedback. And I think the team got better at hearing that and then pivoting based on that feedback over time. But co-op is one, definitely where they were trying to think about, based on what they were hearing, how could it be better?
No, it was really cool. There's so much I want to ask you about StarCraft II, specifically, your take on esports in general and all of those things. It's such a wealth of interesting conversation to be had there. But one of the things specifically I want to ask you about, because I know you were involved in this in the last couple of years, is this DeepMind stuff and the growth of AI around StarCraft II. And I mean, I don't even know where to start, because I find it such a fascinating conversation, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that, what that has been like, and maybe there's only so much you can say about that, but how did that begin? What was your place in all of that? What are your thoughts on how that has gone? Is there still work ongoing? Like, what are the things? I just find this so fascinating that after Google's look at Go specifically, they looked at StarCraft II as an even more complicated problem to solve and begun work with that. But what was your part in some of that work, and what are your thoughts on it?
It's probably one of the most exciting aspects of StarCraft II development that's still going on today. I think is just the potential for more breakthroughs in terms of machine learning. But they had a member of their research team who had actually competed at a pro level, and he was a Brood War player at that point in time. And so when they approached us originally, it was around working with Brood War. And there is a community developed API, Brood War API, that is used for AI development on Brood War. We came back to them and said, hey, most of the dev team at this point is focused on StarCraft II. There's an opportunity to do something more extensive with StarCraft II than with Brood War. Are you guys interested in that? And thankfully they were, and that kicked off a really big effort on both sides, with the DeepMind team and also with the StarCraft II dev team, to support AI research directly within StarCraft II. So we, in collaboration with Google, created an API for StarCraft II that kind of goes even beyond what the Brood War API does, and did a lot of work to enable StarCraft II to be used not just by Google, but by anybody who's interested in AI research. And certainly real-time strategy proved to be a large problem space for machine learning.
Right.
And in some ways, I am absolutely astonished that they were able to get as far as they have. In some ways, I'm also still eager to see them get even further. And they were at BlizzCon, and they had a very interesting article in Nature about their research on StarCraft II. But while they are better than 99%, or I think it's 99.6% of all StarCraft II players, they haven't yet achieved what they achieved in every other game that they tackled. Like, they're unbeatable in Go at this point. And I think that's also true for chess and the Atari games they've done, and like they've done a lot of other games work. They're not unbeatable in StarCraft II.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think that was their goal.
Sure.
But from the game side, I'd of course love to see if they can get to that state.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating too. Just it's a comment on the complexity of RTS, right? And also the skill of the players who play it. And I think it's a fascinating problem. But I am curious to get your take on, what do you think is going to come out of this? Like, what is the benefit beyond just making machine learning somewhat scary, somewhat amazing, obviously respectable and fascinating, but what are the practical applications that are going to come from this kind of work? Like, is there a benefit here as it relates to maybe even how we make games? Like, is there something about the machine learning that is going to make our ability to make games or maybe even tutorials smarter? Like, I don't know. What do you think is going to come out of all this work besides just fascination about the problem?
The potential, it's serious. People say this and it sounds hyperbolic, but I really genuinely believe the potential is limitless, and it will revolutionize how we make games and also player experience in games. So you start with just the obvious, like they've got an algorithm that's capable of playing StarCraft, and that's interesting to play against. And we saw Cyril take it on at BlizzCon, and so right away that's the obvious. They've already got that. From there, there's sort of incremental things that we can look at, like, it could make recommendations on build order and kind of coach you. It could analyze your replays and make suggestions on how you do it better. So that's one step above playing against you, but it's still very clearly related to StarCraft II. What if we gave it inputs that enabled it to understand how entertaining your experience playing the game was? And like, what are those inputs? I don't know. Is it a brain scan? Is it your pulse, your blood pressure? Like, it's probably some combination of physical data, but given a sufficient data set, it could help us engineer games to maximize entertainment value for humans.
Interesting. Maximize the fun in your games.
Yep.
That's fascinating.
And like, that's not going to happen tomorrow, but that feels like something that could happen. We're already seeing there's a SIGGRAPH presentation on making character animation more lifelike using machine learning. There have been experiments using machine learning to generate 3D models, to generate complete landscapes. Like, the applications around authoring games are huge. And this is just the scratching the surface stuff that we're thinking about. So it's super exciting. And so exciting to be on the front lines of enabling some of this.
So cool, man. Well, I know within the recent months, your time at Blizzard has shifted. I would love to talk about that briefly. I don't even know how much of the world is aware of some of these changes, but would love to talk a little bit about this transition that's happening on behalf of you, your work, and what's next, and maybe get a little sense of what your passion is for the future, where you take all these incredible experiences and learnings onward. But yeah, I would love to give you a chance to talk about that, and I'll just give you a little open mic here. Yeah.
All good. I made the really difficult decision to stop leading the StarCraft II team. That team is, still got tremendous talent and is going to continue to support StarCraft II just as well as it's been supported. But I am super passionate about building something new. I would love it if that turns out to be a real-time strategy game, but don't yet know what that's going to be.
Sure. What do you think the future for RTS is? I know it is such a beloved genre. I mean, we've seen not just the enthusiasm and the passion around this space, but the skill and the drive, and yet there isn't a lot of offerings out there. It's it's StarCraft II and maybe Warcraft 3 Reforged that's coming, but I'm curious to get your take. What do you think this next RTS space looks like? The next version of this genre evolved. What does it look like? How does it, find its place in the space? What are the things that excite you the most about the idea of trying to build something new? Not to have you give me all your ideas.
No worries.
But I would love to get a small taste of that. Yeah.
I mean, on one level, there are so many genres that I would consider offshoots of RTS.
Sure.
And so, you look at tower defense, certainly MOBA, even auto chess, auto battler genre. Like there are so many things that have come out of RTS, and I think there are some who are tempted to draw the conclusion that those are the evolution of RTS, and that the audience has moved to these other spaces and they're not going to come back. I don't believe that's the case. I genuinely believe there is something compelling and unique about the fantasy of building a base, collecting resources, building an army, and like that scale of combat. So I guess I'm a little bit more of a traditionalist, which is controversial, but I think the argument that I hear is that MOBA, for example, got so big that therefore there's a subtext to that RTS isn't as big. And it's definitely not as big as MOBA, but the subtext is that it isn't as big as RTS used to be.
Right.
And the reality is StarCraft II, because I get to see the back end, StarCraft II has this incredibly stable audience, and it is huge. And I'm not at liberty to give exact numbers, but it's huge. And yes, there were spikes when Wings of Liberty or Heart of Swarm, Legacy of the Void launched, but it always goes back to this stable base that is highly engaged, just passionate about the genre. I've heard that the same is true for Age of Empires. Certainly at EA was always astonished at how many players were playing the back catalog of old CNC games. And so I know that there is demand out there for classic, traditional real-time strategy. Obviously, I think there are opportunities to make improvements, but I'm not somebody who thinks that we have to turn it into a completely new genre. Like I think we can make a better, more accessible RTS that still feels like a traditional real-time strategy.
Yeah, dude, that's exciting. I know that's going to be exciting for a lot of folks to hear out there. And I believe it too. I love this space, and like you said, the thing that was so fascinating about the players who do play StarCraft is that they're unshakable. Like it's like all these games come out, it's like nope, it's StarCraft.
Totally.
They're passionate about the games they love, and they are committed. And there's surely will be a need to serve that hunger, in the future. So.
Yeah, and just to share anecdotes around stability of the audience, like. When Overwatch launched, there was impact on the population of other Blizzard games because so many people went to play Overwatch. And looking at the StarCraft II numbers, and I'm like, you can't even tell there was a product launch there. I think WoW Classic actually had a little more impact on us, and I guess just the Venn diagram overlap must have been bigger there. But yeah, the RTS audience is just genuinely passionate about real-time strategy.
Yeah. Well, I know I'm taking up so much of your time here. Let me take a quick look at actually this. All right, we have 10 minutes. I would love to get a little bit of your thoughts on sort of the broader sense of developing games. What it takes to have a successful effort in these very complicated creative endeavors. What do you think makes for a healthy development team? What are some of the key elements around ensuring success? Like, what are you going to try to foster on whatever is next for you, this team that, you have the opportunity to build? What are the key ingredients around ensuring your team is as collaborative and successful in their work as possible? I know that's a massively complicated question to ask, but
It is a big
if
question.
you had to pick, a few things that, as a leader or someone who would be, leading a team into these efforts, what you would look to foster and what makes for a successful development team?
Yeah, there's obviously no simple answer to that,
Yeah.
but I guess maybe touching back on some things that I talked about in the course of the conversation so far, having the flexibility to take the time necessary to achieve quality. So I never want to be in a situation, again, where we have to hit a date at all costs. Like, it's important for ideas to have room. It's important to have the time to polish. And obviously, you can take that too far, but having seen what sort of traditional work for hire development looks like, that is not the way to build an outstanding game.
Yeah.
In my opinion. So that's something I'm very conscious of. Blizzard has this core value of every voice matters, and again, it's possible to take it too far to the point where it's just a crowd that's everybody has different opinions and there's no alignment. But I think the way I've interpreted that value, and it's something I always try to work on getting better at too, because there's a temptation as a leader to be more top down. But I think there is so much value in listening to every voice on the team in terms of the opinions they have, to listening to the community in terms of the opinions that they have, and trying to then find true north. And it doesn't mean compromise everything because there are different opinions, but it's really listen and try to understand those perspectives and make decisions that incorporate that feedback.
Yeah.
I think a corollary to that is just how important collaboration is on a team. I've worked on projects at various points in time where there were big personalities, sometimes on the publishing side or sometimes on the dev team itself. And it's not that big personality is inherently a bad thing, but the ability to collaborate successfully with others and not have people be afraid to express their ideas or give feedback or even be critical when that criticism is warranted. So anyway, I could probably talk for hours about building a good dev team, but those are some of the high level.
Well, man, I have to commend you, watching your work inside Blizzard walls. I think I've always had this immense respect for your ability to listen, your ability to remain open to the various surprises and the passion-driven feedback that comes not just from the community, but from the team inside. And I think I've always had this immense respect for this sense of stability you bring in your leadership. And that's approachable, a listening ear, always there. There's nothing that someone's going to bring to you that's going to, at least that I've seen, freak you out to the point of some kind of, massive disruption. And I think that kind of even keel, unfazable leadership makes you an approachable leader, someone who has ears to hear no matter what. And I think someone who also fosters that in the people who work with you. So as someone who is hearing what you're saying, I just want to commend you as someone who's seen it. And I think I agree with you. I think those are the kinds of qualities in leadership that I would hope for in a team looking to solve these complex creative problems that making games is really. And so I'm excited to see what that would become for you. And it's going to be fun to be a part of that.
Well, thanks for the kind words. I will say, though, I guess I tend to see all of the times that I haven't
done that,
succeeded in the ways that I wanted to. So anyhow, I really appreciate the kind words.
Totally fair. And maybe this is more of a reflection on how challenging an environment like Blizzard can be. I mean, there's a lot of passionate views and perspectives in this company. I'm one of them, right? And it's like I think figuring out how to operate within a framework that's as complex as a company like Blizzard is a challenge. And certainly for someone like me, I had a lot of naivety about how challenging that could be. You know, you just kind of get in your lane, for someone like me, and you try to do your best, but then you don't realize what's happening around you. Someone like me, I have blind spots to those things. But I think you are someone who I feel like leaves an open field of view in terms of the potential of impact around your decisions or the ways in which you talk about things. That's I think is very wise. It's very, it's full of this spirit of being slow to speak, a lot of listening. And I think I have learned a lot from watching that, because I think I did not know how complicated some of these relationships can be. And they should be complicated. There's a lot of people working on projects that they care a lot about. And it just takes that kind of, I think, quiet wisdom to listen more before being so prone to speak about your opinion. And I think you've fostered that well. At least you've taught me a lot about that.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
So thank you, man. Let's talk about maybe briefly about esports. I'm curious to get maybe a few thoughts from you about what esports has meant to you over the course of StarCraft II. Your thoughts on it. You know, how important is that to RTS? It's kind of interesting that they almost seem like they go hand in hand, but hey, should they? Like, I'm curious, you know, like, I want to get your thoughts on that. I mean, it's almost, at this point, I'm sure it will always be a part of what RTS is, this idea of competitive, you know, gaming.
Yeah, and I really feel fortunate to have been able to learn from the inside from people like Kim Fahn, Amy Morhaime, Adrian Harris, like these...
shout out to all of them.
Totally. These folks within Blizzard who really were driving StarCraft II esports. But I guess the first thing, clearly I'm biased, but I feel like RTS is the best esport for a couple of reasons. First, I feel like it's the most watchable. My wife, who is not a gamer, can go with me to a StarCraft tournament and understand what's going on just by seeing the size of the force that's coming in, the size of the units that are coming in, and she gets really engaged at StarCraft tournaments. I think that's a lot harder with shooters. I find shooters harder to watch just because of the perspective and the camera change. So anyhow, there's that. I think RTS is the best esport. It's also just kind of the purest one versus one competitive skill. Fighting games are awesome too, but just, you know, the level of skill that StarCraft II pro players have, it's superhuman.
Yeah, it is.
So, love RTS as an esport. I really, as a team member on the dev team for StarCraft II, found it highly motivating to know that people cared about what we were doing. And, you know, it doesn't have to be an esport for people to care, but man, just the level of passion that you see around StarCraft II esports is motivating for the dev team. And sometimes, you know, there's a dark side to that, and you get people who are very upset about a particular balance change, or people who are tearing down competitors in a way that's maybe not constructive, and, you know, stuff. There are dark sides to passion also, but by and large, I think that passion is just highly motivating, and in a lot of ways has kept StarCraft as a game relevant, and in such a wonderful, you know, 20-year time span for Brood War, coming up on 10-year time span for StarCraft II. Esports have a lot to do with that longevity. So really grateful for that. I guess, you know, there's a question in my mind around, will esports become a business in the same way that professional sports have become a business? Smarter people than me say yes. I'll admit, I haven't drawn a conclusion, but I have questions in my mind, like, you know, can a single game achieve the kind of viewership that even the NHL gets? It doesn't today seem like that's about to happen, but in the future, I guess, maybe. I don't know. But regardless of whether it turns into a big multi-billion-dollar business on its own, like that's not really important as long as it is engaging to fans of the game. So I hope that RTS will continue to be an esport, and I certainly enjoy it the most of all the esports that I've watched.
On the development side, how do you handle that tension between, designing for this super high skill ceiling and also still making a game that is approachable to players of all kinds? I mean, I think you guys did a remarkable job of feeling like there was content for a variety of player types with the addition of co-op commanders. We talked about that as well. And then, ensuring there are a variety of ways players at different levels, whether that's league play, but catered, But even so, we know StarCraft II is a game that's daunting to pick up and play sometimes, particularly if you're going to get on the ladder and all of that. But, as someone who's been in that conversation for years now, how do you make those decisions? Are we making this balance change for this, or do we design this unit this way so it's a little more approachable? Do we add this, this new skill, this button that you have to press, or is it more baked into the ability? Like, there's these kinds of conversations happen all the time around, how we should handle designing these games. But maybe that's just a case-by-case conversation as you deal with these things. I mean, how do you tackle this?
So to be completely fair, like me inheriting a team and a product that was already stood up, I think the credit for making good decisions there goes to Dustin Browder, it goes to David Kim, it goes to these guys who led the balance. I think things that I've observed and learned from them, it really, the complexity in StarCraft of having 3 races means that solutions to feedback are not always obvious. And so a lot of the times that they get feedback, whether that's from a team member watching tournaments and saying, it looks like this isn't playing out as the way that we want it to play out, or whether it's feedback from pro players or the community, wherever it comes from, like identifying that there's a need to make a change doesn't necessarily make the right change obvious. And so they put tremendous thought into the repercussions of every change. And there's a certain amount of trial and error that has to happen, and obviously we try to test changes before we launch them. But there's another aspect to this that I think often doesn't get considered, which is that the balance is completely different depending on what league you look at. It's completely different depending on what region you look at.
Interesting.
And there's even this question of who are you balancing the game for? Is it a bronze player? Is it a Grandmasters player? Is it a Grandmaster player in Korea or in Europe or in North America? Like these are all different things. So much of what shows up in the back-end statistics is also a function of the current meta. And that meta isn't an objective thing, it's a subjective thing. It's like players in Korea have decided that the right way to open or to counter is this. And somebody in another region, or collectively players in another region, may have reached different conclusions. So it's a problem that's so complex that there are not objective right answers. There are only subjective answers.
Totally.
And so a lot of what those guys have to do is not just balance the statistics, but balance the perception of players. And there's definitely an art to it. Like nobody can do it perfectly. It's a very unenviable job. Like David Kim took a lot of criticism for decisions that he made. But at the end of the day, looking at the back-end statistics, the game is remarkably balanced. And there are times that a meta will evolve that becomes dominant, and like we need to be prepared to address that. But it's almost more an art than it is a science.
Totally agree with that. Yeah, it gives something for people to complain about too. Come on, we got to have the drama, right?
Yeah.
There's always something. But it's interesting to hear you unpack the complexity, because I'll talk about it anecdotally all the time that like, hey, this is very hard. Like making these games is hard, number one. Like getting the foundation of those decisions laid is remarkably difficult. But the ongoing decision making that happens along adjusting with meta, or when is this too strong, when is it not, when is it just the perception that it's too strong, even if the back-end data says something different, that we need to make a decision, right? Those are, like you said, there's no real right path. And I think as someone who's been under the heat of those lights for years now, you and the team that you've been accountable for, it's just awesome to hear your take on it, because I sometimes think all of us in our own perspectives, have these very strong opinions, and we just wonder why this doesn't get changed or why doesn't that get changed. But maybe the data doesn't support the change. Maybe, it's a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah. And, there's this other aspect to it as well that I think still gets debated to this day, of, is it a good idea to shake up the meta on an annual basis, change for change's sake, just to have a re-engagement point for people? And completely different conclusions have been drawn for Brood War versus StarCraft II.
Right.
And again, there's probably no one right answer there. I understand the passion for having new problems to solve and new exploration to do, but then also the passion for trying to strive for perfect balance. And those things are at odds with each other.
Yeah, it's interesting because, even a game like Brood War, when left to its own devices, you still see these changes happen, right? And it's almost like the community needs to have those walls of impasse, like, oh, this meta is very, very strong. But if you didn't have that wall, you wouldn't realize you could have done X, Y, and Z to adjust or play against it, right?
Yeah.
And you're right. I think sometimes leaving it to leaving the community to problem solve around these issues is almost more interesting and creative and fascinating sometimes than the developer just, intervening. And I love that about RTS and the complexity of RTS. It allows for that.
We had it come up even in the last 3 months where, in the span of about a month, it went from community perception being that Protoss was ridiculously overpowered and had to be nerfed to Zerg is ridiculously overpowered and has to be, and literally within the span of a month. But the funny thing about even the first instance of that with Protoss was that from the time the first complaints happened, the balance team started thinking about some changes, but we hadn't deployed those changes yet, but the meta shifted, and that changed the opinion. And it turned out, that the changes that we were going to make, which were to address that initial perception, were the wrong changes to make because the perception had already shifted by the time we were about to. And
if you had done that, you would have leaned into it would almost look like you were buffing the negative. Yeah.
So you really, the balance team has to work very hard to stay on top of like the absolute latest set of perception that's out there.
Yeah, and then to know when to just wait, and how long is long enough to wait. This is where the sort of art side of it comes in, I think.
Yeah.
And I love that piece because it really does highlight the need for relationship between the developer and the player or the player base, right? Or at least, like you said, an awareness, a constant sense of listening, and I think that's the thing that I find most magical about the way games are evolving into the current gen. That amount of living interaction that's going on between the developer and the agility around it. Even we can almost move faster than we should in some cases, and maybe the right thing is to wait and to watch and to listen. And it's super interesting. Man, there's so many things I want to ask you about, but when you look at the industry over the course of, I'll start trying to wrap things up here for you because I know we've been talking for a while, but if you look at the industry over the next 5 years, what are some of the things that you hope for this space? Obviously, maybe next gen RTS, the next 5 years, but what are some other thoughts? There's such an interesting space around business models and monetization and the like, and now we have cloud gaming. What are your thoughts around the industry in the next 5 years, and what are the things that you hope to see happen over the course of this next half decade?
Yeah, I think all throughout the conversation we've talked about how constant change is, and part of that is the shifting tides of what platform is dominant or genres that emerge, but part of that also is just technology change and evolution in our thinking along the way. So certainly AI and machine learning are going to have big impact. There is a trend now towards platform subscriptions that's happening with Stadia, Game Pass, Apple Arcade. There's so much going on in that space.
Good thing, bad thing? What are your thoughts?
I want to believe it's a good thing. I think it's too soon to call, but certainly when you look at music or you look at linear entertainment like television and film, it seems like that's been a good thing for consumers to have those subscription platforms emerge. So I want to believe it's going to be good for games. It's really hard to project from a genre perspective what's going to happen, because it's so, I mean, there was this seemingly out of nowhere battle royale trend that happened. Now there's again a seemingly out of nowhere auto battler trend that's happening. And I say out of nowhere, the truth is they came out of user-generated content to a certain extent, and that is powerful. So like if I were going to try to extract a trend, it's probably that what players and enthusiasts create influences us more than the other way around. It used to be game designers were setting the trends. Now it's actually players who are enthusiastic enough to come up with their own ideas are the ones setting the trends.
Interesting.
But yeah, we'll see.
It does, man. Like you look at games like Roblox and the amount of growth a game like that has had over the course of the last decade. I think they've been live for almost 10 years now. It's like 8 years plus or something. And it's mind-blowing to see the kind of engagement that a platform like that has, and that's the kind of thing, to your point, that has me most fascinated by Fortnite's path towards creative mode in Epic's creative mode that they're building out with Fortnite too. I think just a couple weeks ago was the first news around a full playable game made by a community member through Fortnite's creative mode, and obviously reminds me a lot of StarCraft's arcade and sort of the goals that the company had with that as well. And I completely agree with you. Like this is going to be an interesting space to watch. For sure.
Yeah, and I think for all of us in games, like the joy of creation is part of why we love this job. So being able to facilitate that for a broader audience is really cool. And I definitely, we made some effort to support it from StarCraft Arcade, but really look at Minecraft and Roblox and Scratch from MIT. Like there are so many things that are going on around giving broader access to create content, and that's exciting. So.
Super cool. Well, man, Tim, I'm a big fan. Obviously, really excited to see what this next chapter holds for you, and I'm going to be supporting and hopefully somewhat a part of it as it moves forward. But if there are folks out there that want to stay in touch with you, what's the best way? Are you an active social media person, or is it the kind of thing? Is there a best way that people can stay in touch?
For now, and this is shameful, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook.
Okay, you're allowed to not be on those platforms.
I am on LinkedIn.
Nice.
And certainly, if I succeed in getting something new spun up in the RTS space, I hope that there'll be some news to share around that. But anything could happen. So.
Yeah, let me just say, if you're a passionate investor in the RTS space, or a passionate fan of the RTS space that is looking to get behind someone who I think really gets it, please reach out to Tim. This is
appreciate that.
Very talented man with a lot to offer. So, well, man, thank you so much. Very grateful for your time, and very grateful for the constant sense of support I've felt from you around my own interests and passion, and even being a part of this. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Really Thanks for having me.
Yeah, brother. All right, we'll stay in touch, guys. This is Listening Game podcast, and we'll see what's next for this. All right.